right, as you can see, I have increased the size of the opening here. The main reason for that is some of the lath that was in here ended on this stud, and so it was very weak. So when I attempted to put the smaller patch in, I couldn't stabilize it. If your patch moves on the wall, it will always crack. So I cut back the stud on both sides. I'm going to be able to put a fastener in to help hold these in place. Most of them are already nailed here, so I'm not too worried about that moving. But it gives me the opportunity to put a block in on each side that will support our new piece of sheetrock, which I'll show you how to cut, and we'll start putting this together. All right, for this wall repair project, we're going to need several items. You're going to need a screwdriver. You'll need a drill. You may need one or more bits. You'll need a utility knife, a carpenter's square, and you'll need to have a box of fasteners, sheetrock screws preferred, and a wall repair box, sometimes called an old work box. First thing I've got is I got a couple of blocks, and they're taller than the opening because when you put them in the wall, you want them to span the opening and be able to be fully secured so that it helps hold the sheet in place. And then I've got a piece of plywood, which makes an excellent backer. That's going to go up here and support the top of the sheet so that it can't move as well. Now normally I'd put one at the bottom, but because we have the baseboard there, I'm not going to put fasteners through my baseboard because then I wouldn't be able to take it off. But these blocks will help secure the base of the sheet to keep it from moving, and then we're going to caulk the base of the patch to the baseboard before we paint, and that will also help secure the sheetrock. So if you're banging on it hard enough to break the patch, you're probably already banging on the wall hard enough to break the wall. So shouldn't be an issue. All right, grab a couple of screws, my screw gun. Now one of the things we want to make sure is we set the block at the right spacing, because this is 1/2 inch sheetrock and we have plaster and lath, which is a variable thickness. We want to get a median 1/2 inch. It's better if the patch is a little bit recessed, so we don't have to try to build up all the mud on the wall to make it look flat. It'd be easier to make this look flat than make this look flat. Keep in mind this is an old house and there are plaster walls and they're cracked and patched and bulged in places. So it's not going to be perfect, but that's okay. We want it to match the wall and not really be noticeable. We don't want it to draw the eye. If this was a sheetrock wall, we'd want to try to get it exactly flush, or even, a little, like I said, a little bit recessed, and then we would do a nice fairing coat with the mud where you fair it out and get it as thin as possible towards the edges so that when you sand it, it's completely invisible. Take my tape measure, and I'm going to use the second block because I'll be able to measure between them and see what my depth is going to be. If only I had a third hand. I look like I'm just about 1/2 inch right there. So I'm going to pre-drill some of my screws into the blocks that I'm going to use. That will make it easier to get the screws started and screw it to the wall, so I don't have to struggle with starting the screw, holding the block, and making sure it's tight. You will want to make sure you have the angle of your screw right, so if you can't get your screw gun into the wall, that'll be a problem too. So. Now I'm screwing on a piece of scrap wood here so that I don't accidentally screw into my floor, because that wouldn't be nice. All right. Mind the wires. Now I'm going to double check my spacing just to make sure that it's good. And if you can, cheat it back just a little bit so that we make sure that the patch is kind of set in just a little bit. Okay, now get your hand behind it and actually give some force on this, because you're going to be driving into old, very well cured fir wood. And if you don't have force behind it, this thing's just going to float out and be frustrating and hop and skip and jump. I actually have to switch sides. All right, so now we've got this backer we want to put in up at the top of the patch. The wall itself is pretty rigid, but the sheetrock is very flexible, and we want to make sure that it doesn't move at all when we're putting the mud on, because if it's moving, it's going to crack, and it will always crack. So I'm going to make it as stable as possible. Now, a quick note about fasteners. Drywall screws are made to go into solid dimensional lumber, not really plywood. And so it's actually hard to get a standard screw started in plywood, and they don't bite in very well very quickly. And so when you're pushing, it actually will push the patch out of the way, and that can risk damaging the wall. So the fasteners I've got here, there's actually a fluted blade right at the tip, and that actually cuts into the material. And then the underside of the head has some fluting too, and that makes it bite in and countersink. So it'll be very easy for this to go through the sheetrock very fast. So you want to be very careful putting these in, but they will get a good bite on the plywood. All right, I've got my plywood block, and I'm going to use, these are Durock or Wonderboard screws. They work very well on plaster. Got to be careful, they can actually blow up your plaster. So these are meant for putting cement backer board in for tile, and they're good for driving through masonry products such as plaster and lath or tile backer board. Go figure. You can see I've actually got a screw hole here where I did one before. I'm going to gently reuse this one because, again, I don't want to blow my plaster apart. It's just going to be a starting point. See how long that's taken to get started? That's the tip trying to go through plywood. And there it just grabbed. So if you can imagine trying to put a normal drywall screw in through your wall patch and pushing on this without having any support at all, it's going to blow your wall apart and wreck your patch. So the correct fasteners are really key. So I'm going to start these while I can support it, and then I'm going to use the other screws to go through the sheetrock into the plywood. I'm going to try something. You could pre-drill this hole. Bear in mind that it will destroy whatever drill bit you use. I'm going to use one of my special fluted screws and see if it won't pre-drill through the plywood for me, and then go back to the masonry screw now that I got a hole started. See how fast that went in? That was just right into the plywood. These are made for cutting into plywood. They do an excellent job. And hopefully, since I pre-started the hole with the masonry screw, I won't have dulled that and it'll still work. Oop, bit came loose. All right, and again, be careful because that is made to countersink into a masonry product. If you go too hard, you'll blow right through the plaster and you'll have to start all over. All right, we're gonna do the next one. And that's all we're gonna need is these three. You do want to make sure that these screw heads countersink, which means they pull below the surface of the plaster. Otherwise, when you go to put our patch on, you're going to hit that with your putty knife and it's going to pop out every time. It'll be a huge source of frustration. All right, so now I'm going to show you how to cut a piece of sheetrock. Sheetrock has several features which are meant to help you install it. Okay, can you see with the light sheen on here that there's a kind of a line here? The sheetrock's actually slightly thinner. All right, when you put two pieces of sheetrock together, this stripe here is where the tape goes. So you put mud in, you tape it, and then that's where you ferret out so that everything builds up and it comes perfectly flat. We don't have to worry about using that in this spot. It doesn't matter if you do, but we are going to just cut our sheetrock to the right size and put it in our patch. Now, since I cut this off a larger sheet, I've already cut it to height, so I just have to cut it for width. All right, so we're going to measure the opening. We're about 14 3/8, so you know, sheetrock's pretty variable. We're going to pack a lot of mud and stuff in here, so we're just going to cut it at 14 inches and give ourselves plenty of room around it, and you'll see why as we go forward. All right, I highly recommend using a square or a straight edge of some kind. It makes cutting sheetrock much easier, and you just run the knife blade right against the edge of the square. If your piece is already square, you can line it up to the edge. That way you know you get a nice square piece. Sorry, if you have a clean cut on one edge, I should say, you can line up the square and then get a perfect 90 and have a nice patch. Now, sheetrock, you don't have to cut all the way through it with the knife. You just have to score it. I did 2 lines down there. It's cut maybe a 1/16 of an inch deep. Once you score it, you just give it a sharp tug and it will break perfectly on the line. And then all you have to do is take your knife and cut the backing paper. Be careful not to cut your leg, and boom, it's done. Since the plaster wall, like I said, has a little bit of a variable thickness, and we want to make sure the sheetrock is as close to flush with it as possible, we're going to shim the blocks forward a little bit. Now, I could have cut these the exact size of the opening, but I really like having them up behind the wall. I feel like it gives it extra strength and durability, especially for the corner here to stay tight. So we're going to use a little bit of 1/4 inch plywood that I have laying around. If you don't have this and you need to bring your block forward, do that. I'm going to just use a little bit of tape to secure them, since we're going to be driving screws through them anyway. The fewer fasteners, the better, because we don't want to hit one putting our sheetrock on. This doesn't have to be pretty. You're just holding a plywood block in place. Top brace board is flush with the back. It should be right at the right thickness. Perfect. You can see that we're flush along the top. We've got just a little bit of a recess on the sides where the wall gets a little bit thicker down at the base, and that gives us room to fill in the patch without having to build up the wall. All right, now as I said, I'm going to use my magic screws, the ones with the fluted tips, to screw into the plywood. I'm just getting them started. I don't want to go crazy yet. Be as gentle as you can. All right, I got just the 2 original special screws tagged into the plywood. I have, as I said, a couple of the regular drywall screws. And I'm going to use those to sink into my wood blocks. All right, now I'm just going to go back and tighten up my top screws. That'll be less likely to push in my patch, the brace block at the top of the patch. Now I'm running my drill in second gear because I like the speed. If you need to run in first gear so that you can get things to work, then do that. Do what you're comfortable with. All right, we've got a nice stable wall patch. There's no fluctuation or movement. We have to cut in the hole for the outlet and install the wall box. This is called a work box. It's got these little tabs that flip open. When you put them in the wall, they flip open and it grabs onto the sheetrock and will hold it in place. So I'm going to lay that out quick. All right, now I pre-measured where I wanted this to be, so I'm just going to lay that out. I'm going to be 3 inches in from the side of the patch to my box, and then I'm going to be 18 inches up from the floor to the top of the box. It's a little higher than convention, but not outside of an acceptable place for an outlet, given the height of this baseboard. All right. And then 18 inches off the floor. So I do a V shape when I do my measurements, because when you measure over, actually in this case it's vertical, the V should line up perfectly with your mark at the point. If you just make a mark, it could go either way, any direction. So one end of the mark versus the other could be as much as an 1/8 inch off, depending on how long your mark is and how accurate you were. So the V shape, the point should always point to where you're measuring. All right, and then I just take my box and I line it up. Now, I'm not lining up to the top of the tabs because I want these to be on the face. I'm going to the top of the box. So that gives me the space to trace the box 2 more directions. And that's where our box goes. And I'm just going to very carefully score this in a couple directions, and then I'm going to show you how I cut through. You can use the square if you want. The square is a little bit big for this work, so I'm just going to very gently control the knife. Again, you're just scoring. You're not trying to, carve a tree or anything. So just use the tip of the knife, follow the line, do it nice and slow. Once you have a score line, it'll continue to follow. And you just stay in the lines. For those of you kids that can't color in the lines, do your own thing, but you might have to use a little more mud around your outlet. When you're ready to go ahead and cut through, because we can't do the other trick I showed you, once you have it scored, you've got a line to follow, then you can kind of dig the knife in deeper and it will punch through, and just gently pull it to the corners. Might take a couple of cuts, but now see my knife buried all the way through and it's a nice clean cut. Punch through, pull. Okay, now I'm going to punch through. And if you need to rock it a little bit, that helps. Just be careful not to go crazy and blow out your corners when you cut through the openings. Now you could, if you wanted to be daring, try to punch this in and it would flip back and you can just cut it off. I'm just going to keep plunging the knife through. It's okay if that falls in the wall because it won't hurt anything. All right, so the next thing we want to do is pull our wires out. All right, and then we get our box. Now, first time I had this installed in a temporary patch so my daughter could go to bed. But now we're putting it in, so I'm going to go ahead and put this back in. We're going to pull the previously damaged wires into the top of the box and the new wire going to the outlet on the adjacent wall into the bottom. Again, the power is off for this portion. And there's a little plastic tab in here that's meant to keep the wires kind of tight. That's what I'm wrestling with right now. Getting the wires pulled in. The outer insulation on the Romex wire should be pulled into the box at least an inch or so. That way, as it passes into the box, it's being protected. Let's see, we got... I think in theory you can put these in with a screwdriver. I like to use the drill because that way I know it flips the little tab up. Just again, don't go crazy because you can over tighten it and pull the box into the wall or strip it out. I think this one, there it goes. So now our box is in, it's tight, and this is ready for an outlet. Until then, we can just fold the wires up and tuck them in, and then they're out of the way. All right, thank you for joining us today at the second segment of our invasive wall repair and electrical repair. We've got the patch in place and the outlet box set with the wires pulled in. Be sure to subscribe down below and click the bell icon so that you can be notified of part 3, where we will do some mudding and taping and show you how to wire the outlet and get the wall repair finished. So this is Honest Home at Home with you. Don't do that.